In 1935, Perth was one of the most isolated cities in the world. It still is. But back then, it had a population of a mere 230,000 people. After years in the outback and a decade in the southwest, the couple were now able to buy their own home in the suburb of South Perth, overlooking the city. For William, the hard yards were over, and he was soon promoted to the rank of sergeant. For Margaret, the pleasures of the city had just begun. Getting to work for William was just a short hop, step and a jump across the beautiful Swan River. Mr. William Harvey, General President, 1937. The General President-elect, Mr. William Harvey, who succeeded Mr. S. Campbell on December 22nd, 1936, is attached to the General Police Station Perth as Sergeant 3rd Class and is the 9th President of the Union. As if being President of the Union wasn't enough work, he was now encouraged to apply for another position. I respectfully apply for the position of Instructor, Police Instructional School as advertised. Police Gazette 377/37. Chief Inspector Purdue. I have the greatest confidence and pleasure in recommending Sergeant Harvey for this position. In my opinion, he is the one man from our ranks who can fill this important position, as he possesses all the attributes which are essential in dealing with men. Being a strict disciplinarian, yet kindly in disposition, which is a factor for success, sometimes overlooked. In the years to come, many of these police recruits would pass their admiration and respect for William onto their sons, who would ensure that his legend would be remembered way into the 21st century. It was around this time that young Ted decided to go for a swim. On the way to the river, he was hit by a car and left in the gutter by an alleged drunk driver. The driver did not stop. Ted was taken to hospital with terrible hip injuries that became infected with a deadly bone bacteria. Luckily, a visiting American doctor instructed the couple to feed their son a strict diet of vegetables and fruits. The vegetable and fruit diet and the many surgical operations would eventually save Ted's life. Sadly, these injuries took up Ted's entire teenage years, rendering him severely disabled for many jobs, including serving in the Australian Army. Elsewhere in the world, a man by the name of Adolf Hitler was making demands. William and Margaret had already seen the beginning of World War I, and the likelihood of conflict was exploding day by day, as Hitler was making more and more demands on the world. In Italy, Mussolini was doing the same. In 1938, Hitler was named Man of the Year by Time magazine. This monster in the cave was about to release chaotic mayhem upon the world.
Here is the Prime Minister of Australia, the Right Honourable R.G. Menzies.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
From past experience of the convoy just recently through Fremantle, you will agree, I am sure, that some liaison between the civil police and the army is necessary in order to maintain discipline and to preserve good order in the city and at Fremantle while the troops are on leave. After intensive search of reserve officers, the GOC has come to the conclusion that no man is available to undertake the erroneous duty required of such an appointment as DAPM. No selection can have similar qualifications to those of Sergeant Harvey, who not only was a captain in the 1st AIF, but has had lengthy police experience. Urgent, the Honourable Minister for Police. So it was a done deal. William was appointed Deputy Assistant Provost Marshal of Western Command, almost 1/3 of the Australian continent. In his position, he was responsible for selecting, training and commanding all military police in the Western Command District of Western Australia. In January of 1941, the couple's eldest son Laurie had married and enlisted in the Australian Army, becoming a corporal in the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion, much to the anxiety of his mother, remembering that she had lost her first husband to war. Towards the end of 1941, Laurie, nicknamed Jack, and his mates were based in South Australia, preparing to be shipped to the Middle East. While off the coast of Western Australia, an event was about to shock the nation. Western Australia was a long way from the world's hostilities. However, on the evening of the 19th of November, certain events would shock and change Australia forever. The Australian Navy's light cruiser HMAS Sydney had encountered a German raider disguised as a merchant freighter. This ship was known as HSK Kormoran, disguised as a Dutch merchant ship Strat Malacca. Sydney had positioned herself just off the starboard beam, approximately 1,300 metres from Kormoran. The German ship was cornered and had no way out. Suddenly, and without warning, they raised the battle flag, dropped the sides of their ship exposing their big guns, and opened fire. The German anti-aircraft guns raked Sydney's bridge, knocking out the fire control centre and killing all in that area. Sydney returned fire, hitting the Kormoran and setting her on fire. Both ships would sink. Sydney's entire crew were lost. The German crew abandoned their ship. After days, some were picked up by passing ships and taken to Fremantle and Melbourne, while other survivors made it to shore in lifeboats into the vastness of the land unknown, north of Carnarvon. Report of S. Anderson, Sergeant, 3rd Class, relative to the German seaman landing 80 miles north of Carnarvon. I have to report that about 10:30 a.m. on the 25th of November instant, Mr. Sharp, manager of Dalgety & Co. Carnarvon, informed me that Flight Lieutenant Cook of the RAAF, and at present patrolling from Carnarvon, had located 2 lifeboats on the shore about 80 miles north of Carnarvon, and that there appeared to be 80 seamen in the 2 boats, and it was thought that they may be sailors from HMAS Sydney. Just before leaving Carnarvon, the customs officer received information that there may be a few German sailors amongst the men on the beach. I then obtained 2 service revolvers from the police station and took with us. After we had travelled about 20 miles in the direction of the sailors on Quabba Station Road, we met Mr. Keith Baston of Quabba Station, and he stated that he had received a telephone message from the Carnarvon Aerodrome requesting him to inform Flight Lieutenant Cook to return to Carnarvon at once. Mr. Cook then returned with Keith Baston to Carnarvon. Dr. Pickles, Arthur Snook and myself continued on. After travelling about 80 miles, we saw a number of men which appeared to be sailors at a tin hut about a mile from shore. There was also one man about 100 yards from the side of the road watering a few sheep in a yard. Thinking that he was a station hand, Dr. Pickles and myself went over to him and I asked him if he had seen any sailors about. And this man then informed me that he was a German and that there were others over at the shed and 3 of the other men could speak English. We then went over to the other men and ascertained that there were 46 men altogether. Some of the provisions that we had with us were then distributed amongst the German sailors. They were practically out of food. They had already killed 1 sheep and had others yarded up in case they were needed. Up till that time that the first German was met, it was not known that the sailors were German. A note was left with one of the Germans who could speak English to tell the motor trucks to come further on. We then continued further north, leaving these men as they were. We struck the beach about 13 miles north of where the first sailors were found. After travelling over very rough country, 3 RAAF planes were flying above and directed us to the other lifeboat. On arrival there, it was ascertained that there were 57 German sailors from this lifeboat. These men had sufficient food to carry them on for a while, but their water would have run out the following day. At no time during the time the Germans were first met, and when coming into Carnarvon on the trucks and while being detained at Carnarvon, did these men give any trouble whatsoever, and I was the only guard with the 103 men coming in with the motor trucks. The lifeboats were left on the beach and equipment was left. The local customs officer has been instructed to have all this brought to Carnarvon and Constable Sullivan will assist him. S. Anderson, Sergeant, 3rd Class, 1300. As things were evolving fast in Carnarvon, down in Perth and Fremantle, William was arranging to take over the entire Fremantle prison complex to hold the expected influx of German prisoners. On arrival at the port of Fremantle, William and his military police were there to greet the POWs. Always the diplomat. He introduced himself and explained that they were to be interned in Fremantle prison. After the Germans had settled in, he and other officers of Western Command would proceed in the interrogation process, while arrangements were being made for them to be sent to numerous prisoner of war camps in different parts of Australia. Then, within a week or 2 of that incident, the world was shocked.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. We believe the fascists have asked for it, and they're going to get it.
Congress, with overwhelming acclaim, then voted the declaration of a state of war, and the President signed it 3 hours after this historic scene.
The following day, it was Australia's turn.
Men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan. That has happened because in the first instance, Japanese naval and air forces launched an unprovoked attack on British and United States territory. Because our vital interests are imperiled, and because the rights of free people in the whole Pacific are assailed. As a result, the Australian government this afternoon took the necessary steps which will mean that a state of war exists between Australia and Japan.
During late 1941, the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion would be transferred by train in cattle trucks from their training camps in South Australia to the sleepy northernmost Australian outpost town of Darwin. Laurie's wife Enid was due to have the couple's first child sometime around late September or early October, and it was unlikely that he would get to see Enid or his firstborn child anytime soon. After a number of months of hard training and digging shore defences in the oppressive tropical heat, a small window of opportunity seemed to open. For on December 30th, 1941, the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion departed Darwin to travel to Port Moresby in New Guinea. They would then board the troop ship Aquitania and head for Sydney to pick up more troops and equipment. It was here that a man fell between the ship and the wharf. Sadly, he was crushed to death. Finally, and at long last, the ship was to proceed to Fremantle for more supplies and another detachment of men. So this was Laurie's last chance to meet his newborn son. On arrival at Fremantle, the Aquitania anchored off the coast of Perth. At last, the West Aussies could see their loved ones before they went to war. But then, without warning, devastating news was relayed to them. There would be no shore leave. This announcement was met with the utmost devastation, and an event like no other was about to become a little-known part of Australian history. The West Aussies were outraged. Like bloody hell there'll be no shore leave. Many of the West Aussie soldiers climbed out of portholes and down ladders onto small service barges. Some jumped into the water. An officer pulled out his service revolver and demanded they get back on the ship. That was it. Enough was enough, as the would-be absconders knocked the revolver out of the officer's hand and almost threw him into the ocean. Within minutes of the boys landing in Fremantle, they scattered in all directions. Within hours, William and his military police were on the streets and in the pubs looking for the absconders. The Provost Marshal was with the 2nd 4th Commanding Officer Lieutenant Colonel Anketel. At the end of a long day searching through Perth and Fremantle, William was in for the shock of his life as he arrived home that evening. For when he opened the front door and went into the lounge room, there was a big surprise waiting for him. Ted Harvey explains.
Most of them came home, see? And that was the last I saw of him. He came out to see the old man with his wife Enid and the little boy. Of course, the old man looked sideways because he was he was a bloody Provost Marshal, you know. And he says, for Christ's sake, he said, Captain Anketel was down the road there. You got to walk right past there, you know. Anyway, he didn't care much. He was happy.
As fate would have it, Enid fell pregnant that very night. The next day, the two would say their goodbyes and Laurie would disappear into the unknown darkness of war. Would the young couple ever see each other again? Only fate could answer that question. The sad fact was that the very next day, all those absconders who returned to the Aquitania and those who remained aboard were destined to be delivered right into the hands of the Japanese within weeks of landing in Singapore. Everyone in Australia, and indeed elsewhere in the world, were following the siege of Singapore closely.
When Singapore fell on the 17th of February, I was out in the front yard, and Mum came out and she said, it's fallen because it was building up for a couple of days, you know. We knew Singapore was going to fall. Singapore's fallen. And then for months and months and months, we didn't get any word from the boys. No, we heard that they were being put into Burma somewhere, building an airport. Then we got a little card saying that keeping well, with friends, text record and Harry something or other. Only a little card like that. And then for 12 months or 2 years, we never heard another thing, and they were put on the Burma Railway.
At least Laurie was still alive, so hope prevailed for now. However, little did anyone know of the conditions of the POWs. As for Margaret, another shock was about to hit her hard. The couple had reluctantly given their consent to their second-born son Kevin to join the military. Margaret was devastated to the core when Kevin suddenly announced that he too had joined the army. At just 19 years old, young Kevin, now a soldier, would ship out to the Pacific Islands. With all the mental stress of her past life, the other children were noticing that Margaret's mental health was starting to deteriorate. She was now more than ever placing her faith in the hands of Jesus, sometimes at the expense of family life. As for William, work was as busy as ever. For now, Fremantle had become the largest US submarine base, second only to Hawaii. There was also a large presence of US, Dutch and Australian flying boats based on the Swan River, opposite the University of Western Australia, to be looked after. However, it was the visiting troop ships that demanded his attention the most, as many men from all over the world mixed with alcohol would sometimes turn deadly. So William was always there, at times becoming unpopular with publicans when he would shut pubs down due to ongoing drunken behaviour that in other parts of Australia would turn into outright riots. By early 1944, the family had heard precious little from Laurie and had no idea where he was or what was happening to him or the other boys. Sadly, the reality was that the Japanese were starving, working and beating these men to death on what would become known as the Death Railway. During the war years, the tall army officer would be seen standing at ease under the Perth Town Hall clock, awaiting a special meeting with Laurie's wife Enid every Friday afternoon. On her arrival, he would greet her with outstretched arms. In his right hand, a hidden roll of pound notes would be discreetly passed to her to help her manage with her 2 infant boys in these most trying of times. That was William, always thinking of others. In March of 1944, Perth and Fremantle military units were put on high alert, as it was reported that Japanese warships were heading towards the southwest of Western Australia. Defence forces were immediately reinforced and ready to defend the military assets and people of this isolated area of the world. Thankfully, it all turned out to be a false alarm, so life went on, but it was a scare that many would remember for the rest of their lives. Now that the threat of invasion was over, William retired from the army and returned to the police force. All the services were represented, including the United States Navy, and all speakers emphasised Major Harvey's fairness and tact in carrying out his duties over the past 4 years. Provost man back with police. Last night, more than 250 members of the Navy, Army, Air Force and US Navy said goodbye to Major W. Harvey, MC, Deputy Assistant Provost Marshal. So once again, there's the example of his character. In September of 1944, tragedy to the north of Australia was unfolding.
What happened was that after they finished building this railway, those that were the fittest, or so-called fittest, they all went back to Singapore, and the ones that were so-called fittest were transferred onto merchant ships to be sent to Japan to work. Now this was rather inviting to them because they would have had cooler conditions and possibly better food, working in the coal mines. So anyway, off they go, and there was 1,300 on this particular ship. But before they were shipped out of Singapore, each man had to carry a 2-foot square block of rubber. It was Japanese war effort. Malaya in those days was the chief rubber producing place in the south. And when the ship got hit by 2 torpedoes, it took 12 hours to sink to this rubber on board, And apart from those that were killed in the explosion, all the rest got into the sea with makeshift rafts and different things. The Japanese destroyers came alongside them, picked up all the guards and left the rest to die, But anyway, they're in the sea for a couple of days. In the meantime, the Yanks are sinking the rest of the convoy. And then the submarines came back overlooking, And they were under the impression that these prisoner of war ships were Japanese troop ships. Being a ruthless war, they started machine gun them in the water, One officer on the coning tower of one of these American subs was watching them through binoculars. Being a smart sort of occult, he said, "Hey, that bloke's got their curly hair." He said, "They've all got dark hair, So they investigated a bit further and found that they were prisoners of war. And they rescued as many as they could. The submarine can only take so many, and washed them down with diesel land, and they were covered in oil and shit.
But what about back in the Harvey family? What was happening there? And what was the state of Margaret's mental health now?
She came out of the bedroom at telephone one morning and she said, he's gone. What do you mean he's gone? Oh, I saw him in the water with all this water bubbling up around him, Yeah. And of course a fortnight later we got the official thing that he was lost at sea. Mother's intuition, they call it.
Although still grieving the loss of his firstborn child, work had to continue as William was now posted to be sergeant in charge of Fremantle Police Station and was also the prosecuting sergeant in the Fremantle Police Courts. Finally, some good news. The couple's second-born son Kevin finally arrived home from his war service in the Pacific Islands, so at last there was cause for subdued celebration. Of course, with Fremantle being a port city with all sorts of characters coming and going, there was never a dull moment when you are prosecuting criminal offences day after day. Everything from minor matters like vagrants drinking cocktails of a mixture of tomato sauce and methylated spirits to prostitution, fighting, illegal bookmaking and false address. The address that Travia gave the sergeant was 21 Russell Street, Sergeant Lidlow's address, right up to murder. She is alleged to have murdered Hilda May Black at Fremantle. Remand on murder charge. Alleged to have murdered his father. Criminals just never give it a rest, and by now William had seen it all. After many decades of faithful service, William had now become Police Inspector William Harvey MC, to spend the rest of his police career as Inspector in charge of Fremantle Police District. On the final day of 1949, William, along with a number of other legends of the West Australian Police Force, would retire, thus bringing an end to an era that would be remembered as the golden years of the police force of Western Australia. However, it was not over yet. After the war, it was found that many untrained men would take up the art of men's hairdressing, causing many problems and complaints from the general public. Inspectors of barbers and hairdressers would be employed to make sure that these establishments were licensed and operating within set rules to stamp out the undesirables from the trade. William was approached and offered the position of Inspector of Hairdressing to identify the unlicensed operators in Perth and Fremantle. With a motor vehicle supplied and paying conditions agreed to, he accepted the job. One day, he entered a particular barber shop and was greeted with a, "G'day, Bill Harvey, how you going?" You wouldn't believe it. Here in front of him was an old foe, one Frederick Moger Playford, last seen by William in Manjimup in 1935. On questioning, Playford would explain that after his decades-long criminal career, he had learned the art of hairdressing whilst in prison and was now a qualified barber and proudly presented his certificate. In discussion, he would tell William that out of all the many dealings he had with the coppers, William was the only cop he ever respected and liked. From a career criminal's mind, this was high praise indeed. A few years later, the now ageing ex-cop was poached by the horse racing industry to form and train an armed escort to transfer racetrack monies from race courses to banks during and after race meetings. He subsequently retired for good in the mid-1950s. He was now a Justice of the Peace and was incredibly busy officiating over police ceremonies and many happy and sad personal occasions. Harvey lives on in police law as one of the grand old men of the force. If younger officers had problems and wanted advice or needed a master of ceremonies on happy personal occasions such as weddings, he was one understanding, warm-hearted and reliable senior officer who would listen and help. It was around this time that I became aware that he was my grandfather, but I never knew his past as he was always just a gentle, quietly spoken, white-haired old man who was kind to my brother Raymond and myself as he was to all around him. He was often seen entering festive gatherings via the front door, greeting folks on the way, then out the rear door and on to the next engagement. A very popular man indeed. As far as Margaret was concerned, well, she always made me feel very special indeed. Of course, I never realised that my father and my mother had named me after her son Laurie, so it all makes sense now. But back then, I had no idea. She always referred to me as Master Lawrence in such a sweet manner. As I approached my teenage years in the early 1960s, I was more aware of my grandparents, but nothing was ever mentioned about their lives until later in 1964. In May of that year, old Margaret was stricken down with a stroke and was admitted to Perth Hospital. Her condition seemed to improve in the coming weeks, so things were looking up. I do remember being invited to visit the dear old lady in her hospital bed. On entering her room, I heard the wireless playing a song I'd never heard before. Margaret was happily singing along when she saw us. The people on the wireless was a group of young Englishmen known as the Beatles. She was still a Pom at heart. A week later, she suddenly took a turn and passed away at the ripe old age of 75. Unknown to her, she had become a proud old lady who was largely an unknown hero of her times in Australian history. Soon after her death, William asked my father and myself to be with him while he sorted through an old treasured locked steel sea chest that was full of his life's memorabilia that had never been seen by anyone other than himself. It was that night that started this whole story that we have just witnessed. In this treasure chest of one man's life was an astounding collection of an impossible life of one very humble man. Soon after that night, the old soldier himself passed on, and after that, so did the contents of the old chest of memories. You see, my father Ted took possession of that chest and its contents. As a young lad of just 13, I witnessed my father destroying many of his father's war trophies like German and Turkish bayonets cut up to make knives. Whatever happened to that small Beck's aspirin bottle filled to the brim with small gold nuggets that his father had picked up off the ground during those long, hard horse patrols in You and Me, I will never know. The Luger pistol in its leather holster with its live ammunition that was handed to his dad by the surrendering German machine gun officer, leading to William being presented with a military cross for gallantry by the King of England, was never seen again. His 4 personal hand-bound leather diaries from World War I were handed to the Returned Service League for safekeeping, being lost forever. And what happened to all the many photographs he had taken and had been taken of him in India, Egypt, the trenches of Gallipoli, France, Belgium, England, Australia, and many other places? Well, sadly, when my father went to the northwest of the state for work, he handed the remains of the chest over to his younger brother Pat for safekeeping. Sadly, Pat and his wife Paulette had separated. The last I heard was that Pat developed mental issues, and in one of his tantrums he threw everything of his father's away. The old fella's war medals from 2 world wars were gone forever. Now every last item of a great man's life has all gone, but my memories of that one night in 1964 has now become this amazing true life story of a true hero of his time. In his lifetime, he witnessed mankind exploit the use of electricity, the birth of the motor car, the telephone, moving pictures, wireless, the aeroplane, 2 world wars, television, refrigeration, depression, jet aircraft, man in space, and most of what we take for granted today. It was truly a wondrous time in the evolution of human history. Along with many other pioneers of this great land, the couple, along with my brother Raymond, now rest in peace in the Catholic corner of Karrakatta Cemetery in Perth, Western Australia.
Thank you.